Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, let's get going. Well, hello and welcome to Helping Anxious Kids. This is a quick lunch and learn. If you have never come to one of my quick lunch and learns, I believe you should be able to eat and learn at the same time. So we're going to talk for maybe 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how many questions you guys have. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat as we're going, but I will definitely go back to the chat box and at the end and make sure that we review so that we have everything on the recording. If you have a question and you feel like, I don't know that this is something I want to type, you want to talk, go ahead and put in the chat that you would like me to unmute you, and I will definitely make sure at the end, if we have time, that we will go back and unmute you so we can have a conversation, okay? So I'm going to introduce myself briefly. My name is Kavalyn Day. If you've not been to one of my workshops before, I know I have people that are coming on here for various ways, but this is a picture of my oldest daughter, who is my passion for talking about mental health. She is currently 26 years of age, so as you can tell, this is an older picture, but I love looking at this picture because it was the first time I realized that my grandson completely has his mom's face. But it's also enjoyable for me because this was my daughter, who probably has the worst anxiety of my kids. This was before we really started to see all of those signs and symptoms that we'll talk a little bit more about today. But really, she did a great job in school. She was one of those high-performing kids. And I wish now, kind of looking back, hindsight being 2020, that I knew sooner that she needed more support. And so now part of what I get to do and really enjoy doing and I'm passionate about doing is making sure that people understand what mental health challenges look like in the classroom for kids, how we can be more supportive in the classroom for kids. And what are some of the things that we're doing that are maybe be making things a little bit harder for them as well. So this is me. If I have never seen you in person, I am Kavalyn Day. As I said, I'm a school counselor by trade. I currently practice as a family and business coach and educational consultant, which means I'm in and around schools all across the state, all across the country at this point. And I'm talking about everything from student mental health and wellness to staff mental health and wellness. And my background goes beyond my master's degree in education. I've worked in foster care, daycares, after school programs. And like I said, I am a mother of actually 4 daughters. So that one picture was one of my 4 daughters. And I'm actually a Mimi to 4 grandsons. So I have quite a bit of experience with anxiety as both a professional, but also as a parent. And so I bring both those perspectives together when I talk about interventions and strategies, because I think sometimes we miss one or both of those sides. And really, the kids need both pieces of the puzzle to be on the same side. So our objectives for today, we're going to explore some current understanding of anxiety, including some of the more common and less common presentations. We're going to look at some of the things that you as a program can do to support your students. And this might be things that you are individually doing, but also things that you might be advocating for within your building. And then we're ultimately going to talk about some intervention strategies as well. In the chat, if you wouldn't mind, as we're getting started, if you have any specific questions or challenges about working with anxious kiddos, please go ahead and put those in the chat so that we can go back and look at those, make sure we've addressed all the questions that you have. So I always like to start with the concept that children do well when they can. So when we see a child who is either overstimulated, hyper emotional, or extremely defiant or frustrated, we always want to ask ourselves, what is it that's causing this behavior? Because children truly do want to please the adults around them. They do want to please the people in their lives. And so if they are struggling with the behavior, there's always a reason for that. So we always want to keep our investigator's lens open to look for what might be preventing kids from doing well. So let's talk about some current data, which is probably why some of you guys are here. When we're talking about mental health and the mental health needs of children, and there's been some recent articles that are talking about schools are increasingly being held responsible for the mental health and well-being of children, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to be able to do that. And so there's lots of conversations going on in the mental health side of things as to whether or not the school setting is the most appropriate place to address these things, or if they're, they have the capacity to address these things, and what's the best practices on that. So there's lots of conversations going on about that right now. But here's some of the data. So number one, about 20% of public school students have a diagnosable mental illness, anxiety being one of those. But about 80% of those kids will not receive treatment. So that means if 20% of the kids in a classroom, so a classroom of 30, that means that 6 of those kids might have a mental health diagnosis. That means probably 5 of those kids are not going to be getting outside treatment, which is the challenge that we're facing in the classroom. If you think those statistics are similar to your building, give me a 1 in the chat. If you say that these are probably in line with what you're seeing, give me a 1 in the chat. Now, when it comes to anxiety, about 13% of people will experience some anxiety at some point in their lives, right? So between early childhood, when we really start kind of identifying that, all the way through adulthood. But here's something, if you were at the middle school level, I thought was really interesting. About 25 to 33% of adolescents are experiencing anxiety. So that means that 1 in 4 all the way up to maybe 1 in 3. So if you're talking about a classroom of 30, you're not talking about 10 kids that are possibly experiencing some anxiety, right? So that's a pretty significant number. And then about 50% of students with anxiety will also have an additional mental health disorder. And the challenge here, I think, for us to keep in mind is that sometimes anxiety presents as the primary reason why we are seeing a kid, but oftentimes anxiety is the secondary diagnosis, right? So they might have ADHD or autism, and then there's that twinge of anxiety with it as well. So when I talk to people about behavioral interventions, one of the challenges that they'll say is, well, I've tried everything. And part of it is when you have comorbid diagnoses or 2 diagnoses that go together, if you're only looking at one, and that intervention is kind of contrary to the other one, you've got to know exactly where the behavior is coming from. So that 50% of kids having more than 1 diagnosis is a real challenge, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So when we're talking about program-wide, when we're thinking about the entire school, what you're doing for every child, what we might call that universal layer of support, what we want to make sure that we're doing is, number 1, creating comprehensive programs that include mental wellness initiatives. So it's not enough just to talk about mental illness. We have to talk about what it looks like to actually be mentally well. We have to educate staff to provide the proper responsive strategies to students on a consistent basis. And that might mean how they're communicating with students on a day-to-day basis, but it also might be how they're choosing the curriculum that they're using, how they're outlining the syllabus and the lesson plans, how they're structuring when things are due and how things can turn, how kids can turn things in. All of that is either impacting positively or negatively the mental wellness of the students in the building. And so we have to be talking to staff about all of those pieces of the puzzle. And then we want to, most importantly, reduce and remove the stigma around mental illness by making sure that we are really in communication and educating our families, right? So we know that not every family is aware of some of the mental health challenges, but more importantly, they're not all aware of the benefits of mental wellness and how to promote mental wellness. So if you are only using your school's Facebook page to talk about fundraisers and occasionally drop information about food pantries, you really want to step it up a little bit and make sure that you are sharing information that will help educate parents about what they might be seeing at home that they might not even realize is an important factor, and how that might be having an impact on what's going on in the school building as well. So we see these little kids, and I love this picture. So we see this quiet little reserved 4-year-old, and the first thing we think, oh, she's shy. We might think she's sad, but there comes a point when we begin to think, is it something more, right? Is there something more going on in this situation? Is there something that we're missing? Is there something that we should be possibly considering more specifically. And so these are some of the things when we're talking about anxiety, these are some of the things that we might expect to see from a child who would have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. So they might be nervous or worried or fretful. So I've seen kids kind of, maybe biting their nails or twiddling their thumbs. They're just kind of generally nervous. And we normally would notice that at certain specific situations. So it wouldn't be uncommon that you're getting ready to have a test and you would see a child that's a little bit more nervous or fretful, right? So you might notice that. But when you notice that nervousness or fretfulness seems to be their set point, and as opposed to something that just occasionally happens, that's going to raise a red flag. Kids who might want to be controlling or bossy, while anxiety is typically seen as an internalizing diagnosis, there are some times when it can externalize and become bossy and controlling, as kids who are anxious are looking to find a way to bring in some structure and some order to something that feels chaotic for them. Kids who are anxious tend to expect the worst of every situation. We're going to talk about what it feels like to be an anxious kid if you haven't experienced that before in a minute, but they typically will look for the worst case scenario every single time. They often avoid groups, crowds, or social events. I also see them being kind of what I call the fringe kids. So you might see a group of friends, there might be 4 or 5 or 6 of them, and there's maybe like 3 or 4 that always seem to kind of be chatting and engaged, but then there's one that's always just kind of on the edge. They're there, but they're not really talking to them, right? So that's kind of that fringe thing. The nervous energy, maybe they feel more anxious and so they're moving around and they're fidgety, right? They might be overly emotional. You might see them crying more frequently. They might get angry more frequently as well. And then of course we know those OCD and compulsive behaviors. So in the chat, let me know which one of these you feel like you're seeing most frequently. And then also let me know what age group you are serving as well. But here are some of these less common presentation. And this is one of the things that I definitely wanted to make sure that I touched on today, because this is according to the DSM-5. So these are things that are diagnostically relevant that we might be missing in a classroom setting. So a kid who is restless. So oftentimes a kid who is restless, the first thing we automatically think of is ADHD, right? And it's not saying that they don't have ADHD, but very easily they could also have some anxiety, or it could be, instead of ADHD, actually anxiety. Kids who are easily fatigued. Anxiety often presents itself before bed. It disrupts sleep. And so kids are more tired throughout the day. The other piece of it is, if you've ever been super stressed about something or worried about something, you just have that extra cortisol running through your body, which tends to make you more tired. So if you see a kid who's kind of got their head down, they're sleeping in the class all the time, and you feel like they're not motivated or not excited to do the work or not engaged in the classroom, sometimes that can be a signal of anxiety. Often kids who are anxious have a difficult time concentrating because their mind is racing with other thoughts of things that might be what might seem to be completely unrelated. They can be irritable, either because they're tired or because they're on edge. But they can be, that anxiety can kind of heighten their awareness to other stimuli, which makes them more likely to react to things around them. I know we sometimes look at kids who have ADHD and they are oftentimes engaged in lots of conflicts, but sometimes that could be a sign of anxiety. That muscle pain and tension, that is a really, really common one. So if they're getting headaches because they are just kind of on edge all the time and they get, their shoulders are tight and their muscles are tight, that can be an indicator of anxiety as well. Stomach irritation and bowel issues, there is a lot of research right now on the link between stomach health, digestive health, gut health, and anxiety. When we call the stomach, that secondary brain, absolutely. If you have a kid who is constantly having constipation issues or having accidents at school, or mom is telling you that they're constantly, not going to the bathroom, that could be a possible sign of anxiety. Kids who avoid activities, maybe activities that they previously liked, or maybe activities that they have said they enjoy outside of school, but they are avoiding them in school, that could be a sign of anxiety. And often substance use and abuse, we kind of discount as teenage angst or just kind of, pushing boundaries. But oftentimes kids are self-medicating in a way that seems socially acceptable, right? And then that can sometimes lead to abuse down the road. So if you are seeing any of these in your building, give me a 2 in the chat if you are seeing any of these kind of less common things that you're maybe thinking on the back of your mind, like, oh, I wonder if that might be something. Give me a 2 in the chat. Okay, good. So we're on the right track. Perfect. Okay, so here's kind of first bullet point of the day. We want to make sure that what we see changes based upon what we are looking for. If you are just looking for how to discipline kids, you're going to miss an anxious kid all the time. If you are looking for a kid and you are thinking that they're just trying to get out of class and they just want to sit in the nurse's office for no reason, you're going to miss a kid who might be an anxious kid. If you're looking for that kid and they're kind of distracted and you think that they're just unengaged, you might be missing something more significant. So we want to make sure that you are looking for these things, and most importantly, that you are sharing this information with those that you are, in the trenches with as well. But keep in mind that there's more than meets the eye with anxious kids. So kids who have anxiety can also be highly intelligent. They can also be extroverts. I know that sounds completely crazy, but they absolutely can. Having anxiety does not mean that you never get energy from being around people. It doesn't mean that you only want to be alone. It can mean that your social anxiety prevents you from comfortably being around people. But if you think about the way those two different things can kind of coincide, if I need to be around people to get energy because I'm an extrovert, but I'm constantly worried about how I'm going to be perceived by people because I have social anxiety, you can determine how that can be such, create that internal conflict that's very disruptive to a student as well. They can be passionate about activities and great performers. My kids ask me all the time, like, why do so many celebrities have drug problems? And I say, being a celebrity, being a great performer, being a wonderful actress or actor does not mean that you don't have problems. And it just means that you have access to more opportunities. And one of those opportunities is drugs that you can afford, right? Or doctors who will prescribe you things that you don't necessarily need, or people who want to keep you happy, so they give you the substances that you are asking for even though you shouldn't have them. And a lot of times we live in a society where it's completely appropriate to socially engage in certain activities, whereas it's not necessarily as appropriate or accepted to have conversations about your emotional well-being. I mean, if you think about it, I spend a lot of time with working moms, and it's completely acceptable for a working mom to talk about having a glass of wine after dinner. Most people do not bat an eye at that one way or the other. But there's still a lot of people that if I were to ask them if they have seen a therapist recently, they would be ashamed to raise their hand. So part of that is what we have to begin to look at in terms of shifting the culture. Some kids with anxiety can be very responsible and mature. They might be people pleasing. I have a couple of these in my house. They don't want anybody to be angry at them. They would rather, be miserable and unhappy than to think that they are letting somebody down. They can be very highly motivated and high achieving as well. So that's probably another point. It's important to remember that there's kind of a dichotomy with kids who are anxious. The motif that we've always had is that shy, reserved kid in the back of the classroom who's just kind of fidgeting and quiet, but that's not necessarily the case. Every time we see one of these, these unfortunate cases where there's a teenager or a college student who seems like they're so popular and they have everything going for them, and then they complete suicide. And you think like, well, what happened? Everybody loved them. They had so much going for them. It is completely possible to be highly successful on one front and be internally miserable. And so it's important that we are looking closely at the needs of kids and not just at, what it might look like on the surface. Okay, so the anxiety-related diagnoses that you might be seeing in your building would be generalized anxiety, which is that overwhelming ability to kind of overthink things, assume the worst of a potential situation, but just in a generalized format. So you can be anxious in any setting. That social anxiety is more related to your interactions, your social interactions, not necessarily in large groups, could be a small group, but it's that social component that goes with it. Then there's phobias, which are the fears of specific things. So you're not necessarily have generalized anxiety, but you're specifically afraid of certain things. Then there's that panic disorder where you just begin to dread something in such an overwhelming way that it almost takes over your entire body. You got separation anxiety, which is more about leaving from people or places that feel safe to you and having anxiety about that. And then kind of what can coincide, but kind of also the flip of that is school refusal, where you're afraid to go into a space. And that may be partly because of something that you're giving up, but might be part of what you are experiencing when you get in there as well. So what does anxiety feel like to kids? If you've never experienced anxiety, I want to spend a little bit of time on this, just so that you make sure you know what these kiddos are feeling. Because if you are not aware of what they are thinking or feeling, you might say something that completely reinforces them or completely makes them feel like they have not been seen or heard by you, and then they're going to shut out whatever you're saying, okay? So kids who have anxiety feel like something bad is happening, right? So you might think like, what's the big deal? And they feel an impending sense of doom that something bad is happening, or that something bad is about to happen that they want to avoid. I am going to die. I know this sounds completely crazy, but anxious kiddos often feel that they are going to die. My oldest daughter that I talked to you about earlier today, she told me a story probably in the last couple years about the first time she went to sleepaway camp. This was a sleepaway camp that was like run by a family friend, so we were very familiar with the people. She was going with her cousin, so she had built-in buddies. And she literally talked to me, I mean, probably, like I said, in the last couple of years, about how the entire time from when we signed her up, which was probably January or February, all the way up till she went in June of that year, she worried almost every day that when she got to camp, she was going to die. She literally thought she was going to go there was going to be some type of an accident, and she was going to die. And I thought, I cannot believe as a mom, I didn't know that. And I said, but you never said anything. And she said, I knew I should be able to handle this, and I didn't want to disappoint you. So she never said anything, right? And so a lot of times, because kiddos have these feelings that a part of them, that intellectual part of them says, that doesn't make sense, right? They feel a lot of shame. So if there's a kind of that third point that I want you to remember, is kids with anxiety often feel shame and guilt and embarrassment associated with the emotions that they have, which is what leads them kind of down that rabbit hole into depression, okay? So sometimes kids feel like this will never end. A lot of times we think that having a success will automatically make them know that they will be successful next time. Kids with anxiety oftentimes discount one-off successes as one-off or a fluke, and they continue to that same thought process that bad things are going to happen. They often feel like, I should not feel this way. This is not normal. There's something wrong with me. If anyone else knows about this, they'll think I'm crazy. If I tell my parents, they'll be so disappointed. There's a lot of guilt and shame and embarrassment that can go along with anxiety. And so how we as the adults in the building respond is critical in terms of kids being able to move forward. So what are some of the proactive things that I want you to do? First and foremost, I want you to be having conversations with your staff members about all of the mental health diagnoses that they're going to come into contact with. There is not enough conversation in undergrad education programs about childhood mental wellness. And so they may literally have no clue what to do or not to do. And they may be inadvertently every day triggering students, undermining their ability to be successful. So it's important that you're having conversations with them, whether it's by inviting them to trainings like this or doing these type of trainings yourself. You want to make sure that you have a pro-social program climate. So you want to be having conversations with leadership about things like, hey, I know that we need to adjust the schedule for this, but hey, I want to make sure that we are considering these kiddos, right? If we're talking about you're in a middle school level and you got 25 to 33% of your kids who might be disrupted by a schedule change, let's not pretend like, hey, this is just what we have to do and we just need to get over it. Let's have a conversation about how it feels when our schedule changes. Let's have a conversation about how that might make you feel more anxious. Let's have a conversation about what you can do when you feel more anxious. So make sure that your program climate is inclusive and always reflective on mental health. And then, like I said, that last piece about parent education, I cannot encourage you enough, whether you're doing it in a newsletter, you're putting blurbs out on social media, or you're handing out actual information to parents when you're having conversations, giving handouts at, back to school nights and those type of things. Make sure that you are educating parents because they are capable of seeing these signs if they are given the information. But just like we may not have been given this information in undergrad, when they went to get their accounting degree, they may not have gotten that information as well. So make sure that you are educating parents. That's all part of being proactive in addressing anxiety. Is that making sense to everybody? Give me a thumbs up or a 1 in the comments so that we can make sure we're on the same track. Now, whenever I'm ever doing any type of training, I'm always going to talk about the fact that the number one proactive strategy is relationship. When we're talking about anxiety, here's why. Relationship is number one important because some of these things look like other things. So if you don't have a good relationship with a kid and you go in to do that functional behavioral assessment, or you go in to do an observation of some sort, you're not going to know that this is anxiety and not ADHD if you don't have a relationship with that kid. Number two, kids have to learn through the context of relationships. So in a moment, I'm going to talk about interventions, and they need to have a relationship with you to be able to take these interventions that you're saying and actually apply them. Because kids with anxiety have a tendency to, like I said, dismiss things that are potentially positive, they can ignore things that they think like, oh, no, that doesn't matter. And you want to make sure that they have a good relationship with you, because sometimes they'll give something a try based upon them trusting you and not them actually believing that you're correct, right? Like, I'm going to do what Miss Day said because, I like her, but they may not actually believe that I'm correct. And then they'll get to experience something that's a little bit more positive. But you got to know where their triggers are, and you got to make them feel comfortable to be able to communicate with you, okay? So here are some of the things that you can do across the board. So this is with all your kiddos. So you want to make sure that you're giving frequent, specific, genuine praise. So this is not, good job, guys. This is Tommy. I'm so glad that you took time to go back over your test. You did a great job, right? This is, hey, Tommy, I noticed you did 10% better this week than you did last week. You are moving on the right track. You want to give frequent, genuine, specific praise. If you have classroom teachers or building staff who are lean towards being more authoritative, you want to have some conversations with them about how they're being received. Like I said, because there's lots of shame and guilt and embarrassment with anxiety, you want to make sure that you're expressing empathy at all times, being really clear to kind of normalize those feelings, and explain that many people feel that way, and that there's plenty of people in the building who are experiencing exactly the same thing that they are. Anxiety is one of those things that feels very isolating to kids, which is why it also kind of leads down into that depressive state as well. Establish and maintain clear routines and expectations. If you have a teacher in your building who is struggling with clear routines and expectations, and they're also having a lot of behaviors, please understand that those two things can go hand in hand. When you're looking for a reason why behavior is escalating in a classroom, always take a peek at, has the routine changed? Has the schedule changed? Has there been a seating arrangement change? All of those kind of routines and expectation changes can trigger anxiety in kids. So being just aware of that is important. Like I said, encourage and facilitate social interaction. So it's not enough to just say, hey, you guys are in a group, work together. You got to sit down and model that for kids. You got to facilitate that dialogue. You got to help kids ask questions about each other, and you want to help kids express how they feel, and maybe even talk about, well, have you thought about this, or have you thought about that? It's not enough to just put kids together. And even though they may not want you to be present, I guarantee you there's at least a few of those kids in that building that need your support in that area. You want to model and reinforce healthy coping strategies. So that means normalizing. And I'm going to talk about a couple interventions that you can do right in the middle of your class in just a second. You want to model and reinforce those healthy coping strategies. Don't pretend like you're not feeling anxious when you are. Name it. Give that feeling, that a voice, and let kids know, like, this is a normal thing. I'm feeling anxious right now. That doesn't mean you have a diagnosis of anxiety, but it does give them some language to use. And this might this might not be fun or well received among some of the teachers, but the whole idea of calling on kids even when they don't raise their hand, or putting kids on the spot and giving them a pop quiz. I know we do that in the education world, but please understand that for kids who are anxious, when you hand out that paper and you're thinking like, I'm going to catch them and make sure that they do all their reading, what that kid is feeling is, I think I'm going to die. Right? And that feeling of dread and doom, while we know in reality they're not going to die, their brain doesn't know the difference, right? So their brain takes that and responds to it the same way as if they were looking down the barrel of a gun. And that means that they're not going to do as good on the test, or they're going to do okay on the test and they're going to be exhausted and sick and frustrated the rest of the day because now they got all this excess cortisol running through their body, right? So it's not worth it. So give kids time to prepare. And that might mean that you have to have a separate conversation with those kiddos that have anxiety, like, hey, we're going to probably have a pop quiz this week, just so you know, just so that they have an opportunity to prepare. Hey, I need to call on you one day this week. Which day would you prefer? Doesn't have to be where you're letting them out of things, because we're going to talk about that in a second. You don't want to let them out of the things that they need to do, but you just want to make it more comfortable for them to do it, so you're setting them up for success. You also want to anticipate potential triggers and then practice responses. So this is about having conversations. If you know that they're going to get an award at the end of the year convocation, for some kids, the idea of walking up to get the award is enough to make them not want to get it. And I've seen kids sabotage themselves because they don't want to have that long walk across the stage. So have conversations about that and practice if necessary. And then this is just a special tip for like the little kiddos. So if you have any preschool friends on here, allow those transitional items. Don't, we kind of don't want to be bothered with the loveys and the blankets and the teddy bears and things. But if there is a transitional item that is going to help them feel safe, that they can go over to that cubby once a day and take a peek at, let them have that. That really does do a lot for those kids who are starting to show that sign of anxiety. Remember, what you say and how you say it matters. So you might hear, I cannot give this presentation. I'm going to puke in front of the whole class, right? What you're thinking to yourself is, you're not going to puke. And if you do puke, you'll be fine, right? But what you need to say is, I totally understand. Not wanting to feel sick in front of the whole class. That would make me feel terrible. What would make it less overwhelming while still letting you do your part of this assignment, right? Involve kids in brainstorming because it gives them the feeling that they have some control, okay? And when they feel like they have some control, it allows them to de-escalate from that place of being overly anxious. So give them some time to do that, okay? You might hear, there's no way I can remember all of these formulas. You must want me to fail. And you're thinking like, well, I've taught this class for 5 years. Everybody else learned these formulas. But what you need to say is, sounds like you're really worried about doing well. What would help you feel more prepared, right? Engage them in a conversation to help them process through what they're feeling. Do not shut them down and discount it as just whatever, okay? So what we want to avoid, and I think these are, so we're now, I think we're on maybe like bullet number 5. We want to make sure that these are some of the things that we actually stop doing. And these are some of the things that are inadvertently hurting more kids who are anxious, okay? So number 1, forcing kids to push through. It's not enough to just say, well, of course you can stand up there, right? Because keeping in mind, I have talked to adults at this point in their life who remember that moment where they had to get up in front of the class and do the presentation. And while they pushed through, all it did for them was reinforce that they never wanted to do it again, right? You got to make sure kids have the coping strategies and the practice they need to be successful. But here's the trick. You don't want to allow kids to avoid those situations. So it's about breaking it down into small pieces, practicing, and making sure they have strategies to be successful. You don't want to get into a habit of avoiding those situations because that basically reinforces the anxiety. Don't label kids as just being shy. We got to stop saying that you're shy or you just don't like being around people. You've got to label the feelings, use the language so they begin to have some normal conversations and they can kind of identify where they are, because it's kind of a spectrum. So there's sometimes you kind of want to be around people, but you don't really feel like talking, or maybe you want to have a conversation, but only with but in a smaller setting. So you want to begin to have some conversations so kids are better at expressing themselves. We talked about not putting kids on the spot. And this one is one that I had to remind myself of recently. Letting kids get hyper-focused on an activity and avoid everything else really just trains their brain to ignore the anxiety for a period of time. And what I have found, and you tell me if you've noticed this as well, kids with electronics, they can get so hyper focused on the electronics, it drowns out their anxiety for a small period of time. But the second they get off that electronic, all those thoughts basically come rushing back to the forefront of their mind. And what you'll notice is when they get off the electronics, suddenly now they are more agitated, more irritable. And so we have all these people saying, well, she's addicted to her cell phone. No, what might be going on is she's addicted to the chemicals that are being created in herself by her using her cell phone. And when you've removed that, now you've allowed all these anxious thoughts and feelings to come back to the forefront of her mind. Give me a chime in on the chat if that makes sense to you guys. Next, criticizing or minimizing feelings of anxiety. We do not want to act like anxiety is no big deal. We do want to normalize it. So there's a difference there. Normalizing it is saying, like, I understand how you feel. This has got to be really hard. We've all had feelings of being worried or scared or nervous. However, I want to make sure that we address this so you're okay. But you don't want to say things like, come on, toughen up. You don't want them to think you're a baby, do you? You know, we got to be careful about the language that we use because that really does impact how kids feel. Awesome. Yeah, and we are, Lynn, we are absolutely seeing an increase in anxiety. Now, here's one of the things that I do think there's a couple of things. So recently I've seen you know, if you have a parent that has anxiety, kids are like 4 to 6 times more likely to have anxiety. I think most adults are not getting their anxiety treated, so then they're creating anxiety-filled environments where kids are kind of being bathed in anxiety all day and all night. But I think also we live in a time where we have constant access to the news and we have constant access to, you know, the media. And there's a lot of research that people who watch the news and are connected to the media really have a tendency to have a lower quality of mental health. So I think all of those things definitely are contributing, right? But we want to make sure that we're having more conversations because, again, when you educate someone on, hey, I noticed you felt worse last night. What was different? Oh, I don't know. I was watching the news with my mom. Versus, hey, what happened the other night when you weren't watching the news? Well, it's a perfectly fine night. They might not identify that as a factor in them feeling good or not good. So that's why we need to have more conversations. Okay, so some of the responsive strategies are, number one, recognizing what you're seeing, right? I talk about the behavior safety net a lot, which is name what you see, empathize with it, and teach skills. But you have to be able to recognize that just because a child is being hyperactive doesn't mean that they have ADHD. There's all kinds of other reasons that could be contributing, from sleep deprivation to anxiety, okay? And so you want to make sure that you're having conversations about that. You want to have multi-tiered support. So we talked about it today. I gave you some things that you can do across the board for all your kids. We've talked about, we're going to go into more interventions now, some of which can be used in that small group format, and a couple of which are great, you know, even better for that individual work. So we're going to make sure that we have that multi-tiered support. And then obviously you want to make sure that you're referring as necessary. I know some of my community members who are out in communities where there's not quite as much access to mental health support really struggle. with having somebody to refer to. And I know that's a hard thing, but we've got to look for solutions. There is definitely more organizations that are starting to do virtual coaching and counseling. So keep your eyes open for that. But there are some kiddos that are going to need some intensive support. Not most, though, however, when we're talking specifically when we're talking about anxiety, there is a lot that can be done to reduce the triggers for anxiety in the classroom setting. And there's a lot that can be done in that small group and that individual work within the classroom as well. So anytime you're going to focus on support and interventions, you want to make sure you're doing your best to normalize the diagnosis, the thoughts, and the behaviors, but increase those coping skills. Use some progressive desensitization, which means that we, in small increments, expose them to the things that's causing them some triggers. Now, those two things have to go side by side, right? You can't say, hey, we're going to just try it a little bit and not give you some coping skills to help you manage that. We can't give you a bunch of coping skills and then never expose you to the things that you are saying are triggering you. So those two things have to go hand in hand. So your most common and the most effective treatments include the CBT, the EFT, and the DBT. So CBT is your cognitive behavioral therapy, which definitely focuses on those thoughts, those feelings, and how those influence your behaviors. Your EFT, which is the emotional freedom technique, you might have heard that called tapping. If you have picked up my book, 8-Minute Miracles, which is all about interventions and strategies you can use, I actually have a tapping script in there for you. Tapping does a really good job of helping to move through the energy associated with anxiety, right? Because we don't often think about it, but feelings have energy. So if you have, there's like an actual energy wave that goes along with the feelings that you have. So if you have this anxious energy, you need to move that out of your body. Just talking isn't necessarily going to move that through. So the EFT, which is tapping on points throughout your body, can help you while you're talking to remove that energy from your body. It's very, very effective. I use it on myself, and I've also used it with clients. So that's a really effective technique. And then DBT, which is that dialectical behavioral therapy, really focuses on the fact that you can feel your feeling and survive it, right? So it helps you to say, like, I can have this and this together. So I can feel this, I can use this, I can survive. So it's about having that duality. DBT is really great for tweens, teens, and kind of adolescents, because they often are like, it can only be this way or can only be that way. And you don't have to negate what they're saying in order to give them an additional tool to go with it. So it can be really good for that. Okay, so here's a few interventions that you can try with anxious kiddos. And these are things that you can do in various formats. So I'm going to go through I have a couple slides for this. So I have, and a couple of these I do have in my book, 8-Minute Miracles, which is actually 88 different interventions that can be done in 8 minutes or less. They're really focused on connecting with kids, getting them to have that rapport, to build that relationship, but also using super simple techniques to give them just a little bit of coping skills, just a little bit of conversation in a very short period of time. So if you have a large caseload and you're saying, like, I just simply do not have enough time to get everything done, these are some of the strategies that you can use. So hopscotch, there's lots of ways to use hopscotch therapeutically. So you can have a little hopscotch board in the back of the classroom or the back of your office, and you can let kids play hopscotch while you're talking, right? You can encourage kids to quietly play hopscotch if they need a break during a lesson. So you can have that be a natural part of your classroom environment or your office environment. The other thing you can do is you can put, with the numbers, you can put, like, give me 1 coping skill, or give me 2 compliments, or give me 3 ways to resolve a conflict, right? So you can add some coping skills to those numbers, and then when they land on that particular number, then they have to give you that, that corresponding note, right? So that's a different way. So for a kid who's anxious, you might say, tell me 3 people you can talk to about feeling anxious. Well, I can talk to you, I can talk to Miss Smith, I can talk to my mom, right? So that's the way that you can incorporate some movement, get rid of some of that anxious energy, and also have a strategy that's very simple. So we have the ball toss. So you can have kids write down, if they, let's say they have a lot of different things they're worried about, give them 20 different scraps of paper and have them write on the scraps of paper, ball them up and throw it away. Look, you got to choose which ones you want to hold on to. You got to choose which ones you want to let go. You know, write down all the good things that you have, write down all the bad things, and which ones do you want to hold on to and which ones do you want to give away. It's a really super, super simple strategy. And then this ball one is called All Tangled Up, and you can actually, this is I would say a little bit longer lesson, but this is a great way to normalize anxiety for a whole class, as you can talk about how we all have feelings, and you can show a kind of tangled up ball of yarn. And then you can talk about how all the different feelings are part of our brains, but sometimes things get tangled up, and you can talk about whether you can have the kids cut like, hey, this is a small worry, right? This might be like, oh, I might trip when I tie my shoe, or my shoe might come untied. It's a small worry. Or you can have them cut a string and have that be a longer string. And they might say like, okay, well, this is a bigger worry. So what's maybe some of your bigger worries? And how would we untangle these? Well, you know, I might could give you this into the string and you could help me get it untangled. Oh, great. Then you have some language around it, right? So now they can say, hey, Miss Day, I'm having a tangled string moment, right? So that's the same thing as saying, I'm feeling anxious, but they don't have to say, I'm feeling anxious. They can say, I'm having a tangled string moment, right? And that is another way to give kids some language for the things that they are feeling and give them some ownership and control. Give me 2 in the chat if you think you could use one of those strategies, and I'm going to go over a couple more. Okay, so in a whole class setting, I really would love for us to get into a habit of taking a pause, right? So it's not uncommon for us to say, guys, we gotta hurry up, we gotta hurry up, we gotta hurry up, we got so much to get done. And how often do we say that and actually trigger the kids in the classroom who already feel like they don't have enough time? Just taking a pause can be so simple. I do something called a 1-minute meditation where I have like a bell I'll ring, and then I'll just say, close your eyes when you hear the bell, open your eyes when you stop hearing the bell. And it's literally about 60 seconds. And every single time people feel lighter and they feel less stressed and they feel more relaxed. Taking a pause is a great strategy, right? This next one is Simon Says. We all know how to play Simon Says, so I'm not going to go into any details about that. But having something to focus on slightly, right, gives kids a little bit of a brain break. And when we focus on, you know, moving our arms and our legs while we're maybe having a conversation about something that's making us feel a little bit more anxious, or in between, like while we're waiting. A lot of times we expect kids to sit still and wait for the next thing to start. There's no reason for that. If I'm a nervous kid or if I'm an anxious kid, if I actually have a diagnosis of anxiety and you want me to just sit still and wait, that is like a fate worse than death. We got to get used to movement, letting kids move their bodies and releasing some of that energy. And then this is a super, super simple one, which is counting to 10 or counting backwards to 10 from 10 and letting kids feel that relaxation. And you can say like, I'm going to count backwards from 10. And every time I count backwards every time I go down one number, you're going to feel a little bit more relaxed. And I can do this with you right now, really. So every time I go down one number, you're going to feel your shoulders get looser. You're going to feel your body get more relaxed. You're going to feel yourself be more calm. So we're going to go from 10 to 9 to 8. And every time you hear my voice go a little bit lower, you're going to feel more calm and more relaxed. So we're going down from 7 to 6 to 5. And every time you hear my voice go a little bit lower, you know that you are more calm and more relaxed and you feel good in your body and you can handle everything that's going on around you, from 5 to 4 to 3. And by the time I get to 1, you're going to know that you are safe and you are content and you can do anything that I ask you to do because you are safe and you are loved and you are in the space where you are valued. And from 3 to 2 to 1. And in that quick amount of time, I have just taught a kid who has anxiety on their brain to come all the way down. This is also something that they can use on their own, so they can get used to that, okay? And we want to give them strategies that they can use on their own. A lot of times kids don't have 30 minutes to sit and talk to somebody, and if we're the only person they can sit and talk to, that's really not helping them. Does that make sense, you guys? All right, so a couple of resources for you. If you're looking for ways to strengthen relationships with kiddos, I always recommend my book, Drag 'em Kicking and Screaming. But if you want a few extra resources, these super simple, quick, easy interventions that you can do as a part of a lesson, in between a lesson, in the hallway really quick, that would be 8-Minute Miracles. I will follow up with the email for everybody who attended this live to make sure that you have a link to be able to download that. 8-Minute Miracles is an ebook. You can absolutely print it out and put it into like a binder, but it works really well just on your computer as well. It's a super quick, easy read, but just gives you lots of simple things that you can do to create those interventions. Okay, so we're coming up right on time. We're a little bit over what I would like to be, but does anybody have a question? So what I'm going to do, if you want to put a question in the chat, you can. And if you would like to like unmute yourself and actually ask a question, I will make sure that you have access to do that as well. So I'll give you guys about a minute. If anybody has a question, you can unmute yourself. You can also ask it in the chat. And if not, then we will go ahead and wrap up for today. Hopefully this was really helpful for you guys. If this was helpful, let me know in the chat. Okay, articles or things for parents to read to expose them to. Yes, I will make sure in my follow-up email that I send you a couple of articles as well. I have some on my website that I actually talk about kind of my own experiences as well as, research as well. So I will email you some parent resources. Absolutely. And I will give you my tip for parent information. Less is always more. So always give tiny bite-sized pieces of information for parents and then tell them exactly how they can apply it to their lives, right? So, you know, if you're going to talk about the link between anxiety and social media or anxiety and electronic usage, give them a really simple way, hey, just make sure that you cut the computer off an hour before they go to bed, and just give them a journal so that they can write any of their thoughts or feelings, so that they can try and release that before they go to bed. Just give them a really simple strategy to make sure that they can apply it. All right. Well, you guys have an amazing rest of your day. I hope this was really helpful for you. And like I said, I will follow up with an email. For those of you who had to kind of pop in and out and want to catch the recording, I will make sure that I share that with you. And I will include some resources for your parents as well. And you guys have an amazing rest of your day.